do we have? Oh, we do. We have our guest in the room, and he's 5 hours ahead of us. So we wanted to get to him early. Johnny Vedmore, welcome back to Grand Theft World. How you doing?
I'm so happy to be here. I heard loads of what you were talking about there. Some really interesting stuff I'm doing at the moment on this, that I haven't released at the moment. It's I'm doing 5 articles that I've put into draft with UK Column News that covers all of the British side of the sort of culture war between the West and communist Soviet Russia. So that includes all of the Ivor Bryce stuff with Ian Fleming.
Yeah.
That includes some of the crossovers, and I'm looking for the other stuff that there's really interesting things that happened just after the war, after 1945, 1946. There's all the stuff I've discussed in the most recent article I've done on Unlimited Hangout, but there's a load of other things happening. There's a whole takeover of almost all of the darker areas of London, like the London nightclub scenes, the casinos, the organizations in London, all being taken over because it's become this drop point for all of this communist information that's coming in, and everybody's working against each other. Everybody, there's one guy who says it's not like the feeling the world's going to end tomorrow. The world could end right now. So we're all just doing what we got to do to survive, and everybody's just selling secrets in darkened corners. And I came across something spectacular. I came across a lady who owned a nightclub in London, and it seemed like she had been gassed to death to take control of the nightclub. Afterwards, the craze and people took over, organized crime, but then the intelligence services took over all of the nightclubs. Yeah. This is how it started.
I saw that movie. I saw that movie with the twins. That movie
it's amazing. It's Whitney was researching her new book. New books that are coming out, which are going to blow you. I mean, some of the things you were saying there about BCCI and stuff, there's revelations galore. It's just there are 2 volumes of just revelations about what Jeffrey Epstein was actually up to, the proper intelligence side of it, not just the, sex blackmail, look at all the sex all the time. That's what they've been doing. Well, there's a whole load of other stuff that's so serious. I just did not, I could not even, I was telling some of the things that are in the book, and I found myself having to whisper in outside, this is what's going on. It's so scary, it's so worrying. And
does she follow up anymore with the biological? I know there was Zora Ranch and stuff of that nature, and that's where I kind of got very concerned, especially when I first heard her report on that, because I'm wait, they were doing animal human gestation, or trying to bring it to gestation, and real genetic manipulation that they're trying to skirt underneath the regulations that exist from the various nation states across the world. That was really disturbing, and I'm really curious if she sort of followed up with that.
Well, these guys, I mean, I would say that I won't want to spoil too much. I don't know how much I can talk. There's certain things I can talk about.
Don't get in trouble.
It's coming out soon, and it's gonna some of it I'm just so scared to speak about. I just don't know. Wow. There are a couple of things I've been given permission to speak about, but that's definitely not one of them. But there is it's a range. It's a range. There is a range of stuff. But she asked me, going back to what I was saying, she asked me, can you have a little look at this rumor about the craze doing this with this person back in the late 60s or early 60s in a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn. And I went and had a look, and I discovered Esmeralda's Barn was a fantastic interesting place. I started through the history, and I started working my way back and discovered that at one time in the mid-50s, all of these nightclubs in London were owned by these really industrious, fantastically courageous women. They were the women who, after the war, women had been mobilized during the war, loads, and suddenly they had all this creativity, they had all this confidence, and they went out and they bought houses, they did up places, they put in hard work, hard graft. They become rich. You had loads of rich women come around. They bought nightclubs, social places. They had hostesses dining the rich and famous. And then by all through the 50s, you have this sort of like vibrance, and then they all die in mysterious ways. Everybody from Ruth Ellis, who gets hung, the last woman to be hung in Great Britain, in Great Britain. She gets hanged for shooting her boyfriend after being basically mentally abused and tortured by him for years. And there's loads of other people. But the people were around in these clubs, the people who were in these clubs were people like George Huntington Hartford II, who was this big billionaire, playboy philanthropist. I think it's A&P grocery stores. It was the first chain grocery store in America, and his family, his grandfather created that chain, and his father hated his family, and so the inheritance skipped over and went to George Huntington Hartford II, and George Huntington Hartford was like fed completely with a silver spoon, constantly like mollycoddled by his mother, but then had loads of money, was really wealthy, was in the Bahamas, and started going to was just a sex addict. So just went around having sex everywhere, going to all of these sex parties that were being organized by intelligence agencies in all of these clubs, by all of the people who were running like clubs like these. They were all like these major open compromise stuff that would lead to the Profumo affair and the downfall of the British government, and the people involved in it would also be almost lead to the fall of the American government, just as Kennedy got in, because one of the women involved in this was Mariella Novotny, or whatever you want to call her. She's got loads of different names. Her real name was Mariella Capes. She was also known by loads of different things. She was one of the girls involved in the Profumo affair, but she was the girl who was discovered in America sleeping with JFK, and a big hoo-ha was made, and she was smuggled out of the country by a mixture between the FBI and the CIA, and given free pass out to get her, just get out of the country. That's how they dealt with it. But there's this whole time there in 1945 where the BSC had started just at the end of the war, 1945.
All right, so that's the British Security Coordination. You got to translate that for Americans. We don't understand that for the most part.
Well, it was based in New York, wasn't it?
Yes, in Rockefeller Center. Now, Nelson Rockefeller set up British Security Coordination, so they gave him a headquarters, and it was run by Sir William Stevenson. And when you mentioned Ivar Bryce earlier,
an amazing human being. Ivar Bryce is incredible.
I wanted to see, is this who you're talking about? This guy, can you see him?
Yeah. That's who I'm talking about.
He went to Eton. He's buddies with Ian Fleming. He met Ian Fleming
at Cornish Beach. In World War One, they had something that was they had the Zeppelins coming over London and bombing London, the big balloons, and of course that caused great fear. So that was the first kind of like time that they took the children out of the cities and put them in the country. And he met Ian Fleming on a beach in Cornwall when they were only kids. And they got on really well. They went to Eton together. They ended up writing a magazine. Now, the magazine they wrote just before the war together was encouraged by, I can't remember if it was Fleming or Bryce. I think it was Bryce's mother. It was encouraged, but it had it leaned towards fascism. It actually had one thing that was like basically said how wonderful
he was part of the British fascists. He was part of the British fascists and the Baker Street Irregulars, and worked for BSC under Stuart Menzies and Stevenson.
Extremely. He was the only, if I'm correct on this, he was the only British person to be recruited by the OSS and be officially a member of the OSS, Ivar Bryce. He has a incredible history. They rewrite him in stories as well. I was watching some film the other day which included him. I can't remember what it was. It was with Colin Firth, and they started talking about how he was a communist and stuff, and just like it's really interesting how they still rewrite the story of Ivar Bryce and his wife. Now, Ivar Bryce, who did he marry? Do you know who he married? He married Josephine Huntington Hartford, which is George Huntington Hartford II's sister. So they were really close together. And these guys all hung around in in the London cliques. And one of the people in the clique was this very weird guy called Horace Dibbin, who was a Satanist and was the husband of Mariella Novotny. There's so many like links and so many interesting stories. And if you follow all of the lines down, what you discover is like this history of this of all of the creation of intelligence. And it was a very it was all mishaps. The British were trying to, the reason why the BSC was set up in New York originally was to encourage the Americans to believe that fascism was on their doorstep and all around them, to make them react. And it describes what the Cold War would be and shows what the Cold War would be. This, you do certain things to make other people have certain reactions, but they're not necessarily violent actions, aggressive actions. Ivor Bryce, one of the things he did was he wrote a fake map, or he designed the writing of a fake map, which was then to be found on some guy floating in like the Sea of Cadiz or somewhere in Spain. And it was supposed to be like a dead, some sort of dead enemy of the Nazis or whatever. And it was going to then be delivered up to the Nazis, and then they would know somewhere something, and they would do something, and so on and so forth. And he was designing like ways of making America tilt their focus towards Cuba as well, and think that Cuba was potentially bad. It's some amazing, wonderful, amazing people who were involved in all these weird people who were involved in not only this, but they're involved in like creating this myth about satanic sex parties. So they would use
satanic panic. Well, that's in the 80s, but this is going back to the 60s.
Yeah, but they're creating psychological warfare operations. So just as a real quick example, if they're creating myths that Cuba is going to get us, might we react as America with Operation Northwoods? Like, because people make out like Joint Chiefs of Staff was going to kill a bunch of people and blame it. But what were they reacting to? What was the stimulus to their reaction, and why didn't they have some thought in there? That was
I found one extremely incredibly interesting guy who's called said by Horace Dibbin, one of these guys, to be a Satanist, but when you actually learn about him, he's much weirder than that. It's a guy called Andre Gabor Tiamal Bozomeni, and Bozomeni is this Hungarian guy who looks like Dracula. He's a fascist, but he's hanging around with all of the top elite, and he's hanging around in all of the embassies. He's also an inventor, a really interesting inventor, who is working with a guy who was working with the Nazis, a Hungarian guy who was working with the Nazis during the war. And there's loads of links to Nazis in this guy. He represented at one point, he's a lawyer, this guy as well, Andre Gabor Tiamal Bozomeni. And Bozomeni is such an interesting character. But all of these guys are doing the same thing. They're trying to influence. They're working alongside these people are working alongside. They live together. I found records of these people living together, and at the same time they're pretending that they're on opposite sides to different people. So I mean, it's this operations galore, and they're really inventive, creative. By the time they were really scared. 1945, 1946, 1947, they had to be really careful. 1947, things start to pick up. Operations start to happen all over the place on both sides of the channel, on all sides of the world. Really, there's operations going off. But then by the 50s and the 60s, late 50s, especially in the 60s and 70s, it all gets really flamboyant and crazy. Some of these parties that were the sex parties were just like peacocks walking around in the house. There was like a very famous guy called Billy Williams, who was a gangster. He was part of the Brinks Mat robbery, I believe, and his wife Gypsy Williams. He was like one of those gangsters who went along. He actually sold the craze into Esmeralda's barn when it became a casino. So that's where I actually ended up starting investigating and worked my way back. I found all of these characters and just couldn't leave it alone. I couldn't stop watching what they were doing.
Almost like
Eyes
Wide Shut style in a way.
Yeah,
What Kubrick is trying to.
Gypsy Williams tells this story. This what I was about to say there, this perfect example. I mean, it goes very well. Gypsy Williams tells this story that she goes. They're at one of these sex parties. They're watching all these rich people, rich elites who have been having sex with these crazy like women like Mariella Novotny, who were just like over the top, always wearing a hat when they were having sex. Mariella Novotny, she was always wearing a hat, almost the same hat. Lots of people mention how she was always like they'd see her day after day in the same hat having sex with random people. But this Gypsy Williams went up to the bathroom with one of these sex parties, closed the door, locked the door, sat in the toilet, looked across, and saw a peephole with someone's eye looking through it. And it was Horace Dibbins on the other side, who was he himself told people that he had become a Satanist during the war when he was surfing on the Orkney Isles, and he took part in a sacrifice of a woman in a goat ceremony. And these were the people who were working with the intelligence services. These are the people who took over all of these. These took over from the gangsters. These are the people who were so gangster, they were more gangster than the Krays. The Krays couldn't compete with these guys. They just sat and watched what was going on. You know, the Krays loved it. They were making money galore, so it satisfied their needs. They took over. They entered this world because they were East End gangsters. East End is like the rough area of London. This was the West End. This was a different place, and they only entered into the West End in about 1960, 1961, when Billy Williams sold them into this bar, Esmeralda's Barn, and that had been bought from Horace Dibbins. So it's all like all of it's linked, and it's all a way of making things. That I find it so interesting. When I listen to any part of the story, I'm trying to investigate it on both sides of the channel at the same time, and it's some really interesting people. One or two that are just mind blowing. Well, no one know about.
Psychopaths attract one another. I mean, look at Wild Bill Donovan when he said the OSS and when he did in World War One. In fact, I found a whitewashed.
He's in the Rainbow Division.
He's in the Rainbow Division, and what they say about it, I mean, I'll bring it up here. It is hilarious. I'll have to share this with you. So,
and then he got groomed by William Stevenson.
Wild Bill Donovan. In search of a way to serve his country, Donovan joined the New York National Guards Fighting Irish Regiment. And during World War I, the 69th was designated to the 165th U.S. Army, called the Rainbow Division, so named because of the cross-country makeup. Then Lieutenant Colonel Donovan was troubled by the poor training and lack of physical conditioning of his troops, so he ran them in full packs in a 3-mile obstacle course, and that's where he got his name, Wild Bill, because he could still do it afterwards. At the end of the men collapsed, gasping, "What the hell is the matter with you?" Donovan demanded. "I haven't lost my breath." At age 35, he hadn't carried the same load. The voice of an anonymous soldier in the back, Donovan in public expressed annoyance, blah, blah, blah. On February 28th, 1918, Donovan and his battalion entered the fighting for the first time. He had wondered how he would react. Listen to this. He had wondered how he would react the first time he came under fire and discovered he had, quote, "no fear of being able to stand up under it," end quote. He wrote to Ruth, his wife, through it at the danger of combat like, quote, "a youngster at Halloween. Growing up easily accustomed to standing up under fire, Donovan eschewed being a dugout commander and led his troops on the front." And this says everything, because this is the whitewash part. On the morning of October 14, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne campaign, Donovan earned the Medal of Honor. His unit was being decimated by fire from his right, and Donovan's advance stalled with horrifying casualties. What they don't tell you, and this I got from Dave Emery, but Rich, you showed me, which got me this book, The Old Boys, is that during that fight, I believe it was that one, the whole thing was supposed to be a setup. It was supposed to be a retreat. So he's supposed to sort of posture himself with his Rainbow Division to make sure that they fall back, and then he would get reinforcements. It was supposed to get them to, file into them, attack them first. Instead, because he had no fear of battle, he refused to back down. He refused to surrender, even though it was supposed to be a setup surrender. And unfortunately, he ended up decimating and sacrificing most of his division in pursuit of the glory that he ended up obtaining, and then obviously the recognition that came after that. He was also a Wall Street lawyer, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So, and I forget it's in the, I'll look it up, but I forget which law firm he worked for, but he was. So that was Sullivan, but he was a corporate trained lawyer, and he dealt with a specific type of litigation that was very unique. It was very much a part of Wild Bill's history. So when you look at it, it's just like, because I was thinking about this, I'm like, it seems like you're talking about what was the Satanist name? Because it's like
Horace Dibbins and
Dibbins.
Andre Gabor TML Bosmeni, but that one's a hard one.
Say
Horace Dibbins.
I'll think of it like rice. It's a weird because it's like these. I think of like Sir James Fraser or something, an early tribal community when the Scottish anthropologist wrote the Golden Bough. It's like he sort of theorized that in early tribal community, the psychopaths, the ones with that had great guile, that or shrewd and cunning, were able to rise to the top of essentially the tribal order and maintain the cultural taboos as a form of control. Psychological control. I mean, that's a sort of an anthropological recognition, but you sort of see similar patterns and like as we develop civilization.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions and we can get into the show and share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come on.